Mr. President, I rise this morning to speak once again about the impending bill before the Senate, the very large and significant Omnibus spending bill, but more specifically about provisions within this bill that have very little to do with spending and have a lot to do with foreign policy. It's the provisions relating to United States-Cuban relations. And I decided that I would inform the Senate of a few things that are just in this morning's press, and why what this bill will do makes so little sense for the United States at this moment in time, and why it would be a mistake for us to approve the current bill. The current bill is an attempt to, frankly, usurp from the executive the prerogative to conduct foreign policy. And the President, in his campaign, indicated that there were some things he wanted to change about U.S. policy toward Cuba relating to travel and remittances. I would hope that that would be done in the order of presidential prerogatives and not by a legislative fiat, but as it is done in a way that is conducive to the best interest of our nation and the best interest of our long-term foreign policy objectives. Unfortunately, it's being done in a haphazard way without real clarity about the implications that it all will have relating to what is attempting to be done. One of the issues relates, more important than all perhaps, to agricultural business trade with Cuba. $780 million a year business, which is now done by the Cubans paying cash before they can receive the goods, before the goods leave our ports. Now, this was done in the prior administration because, in fact, the Cuban government was not exactly playing it like it was supposed to. And the shipments would get to Cuba, and then payment would be not when the goods arrived, but maybe 30 days later, maybe 60 days later, and it was all of a sudden creating a problem. So we fixed the problem. American farmers are protected. They get to sell their goods to Cuba, and $780 million is not an insignificant amount of sales, but they get paid in cash, and they get paid before the goods leave the port. That makes a lot of sense for America. It may not make a lot of sense for Cuba because it's an inconvenience, but I don't really think that we should be making policy to the convenience of a brutal dictatorial regime so close to our shores who is a hostile and avowed enemy of the United States. But what happened today in the news that is of interest? Well, several things. Let's see, how do we begin? There's been great hope that there'd be change in Cuba because Raul Castro was now in charge. Now, I remember as a child always hearing that Raul Castro was the enforcer, that Fidel was the nice guy, and Raul was the tough guy. Raul Castro is credited with over 500 deaths under his supervision in the first months of the revolution. In addition to that, he's the head of the armed forces. The armed forces that an Air Force plane was directed by him and authorized by him to shoot down civilian airplanes in the Florida Straits, killing 3 Americans and an American resident. That was done to an unarmed civilian aircraft. So there's great hope that this guy is going to be somehow an agent of change, is going to be an agent of pragmatism, is going to be someone who's less ideological. And I remember hearing all the time how the real ideologue here was Raul Castro and Che Guevara. Those were the two ideologues. They were the real communists. It was Raul Castro who first went to the Soviet Union and made deals with them about beginning this arms buildup that led to the missile crisis that put the world in peril. So now we're talking about the future of Cuba. So he's had a shakeup. He's really had a military coup. If it was anyone else other than a romantic revolutionary in Cuba, the United States press would be talking about this as, in fact, a military coup, which is really what's happened. He's tightened the circles, and there's an article today by the AP which talks about the closing of the ranks, and the fact is that the only rays of hope, the only people under 75 years of age in any position of significant leadership, Carlos Laje and Felipe Perez Roque, have both been ousted. And worse than that, now Fidel Castro has said that they were undignified or some other term like that, which means that they've now fallen into disgrace. They're never to be heard from again. They're not going to be the future leaders. Many people thought that Carlos Laje was the logical next successor. Nobody really knows who will be in the future of Cuba. But much like the sclerotic Soviet Union leadership of the time before Gorbachev, where they were passing around the titular head of government between one 80-year-old to another, the Cubans are doing the very same thing. It is the same old guard, Ramiro Valdez, an enforcer, a tough guy, a hardliner, a no-nonsense, kill him first, ask questions later. That's who is really, really as an effective number 2 to Raul Castro today. So there's no real hope of change with this bunch in charge. But here's the other thing that is of significance and importance to our United States interest. This is not about the interest of the Cuban government, and if we buy agricultural products from you, and then you become a lobbyist for us, and you advance our agenda, and at the top of that agenda is we don't want to have to pay cash when we pick up the goods. We want credit. We want the goods to be paid for when they get to Cuba in our own sweet time, which is really nothing more than another way of eroding the trade sanctions that we have with Cuba. So there's another article today in the Miami Herald talking about Cuban influence in Venezuela spreading. Now, we know that Hugo Chavez is not a friend of the United States. And we also should remember that for almost 50 years now, Fidel and Raul Castro and their band of collaborators have not been a friend of the United States. They, in fact, have been avowed enemies of the United States and continue to be at every international forum, at every place where they can be heard. So this story today tells us in the Miami Herald that some 40,000 Cubans are now working in Venezuela. And, of course, Cuba receives 90,000 to 130,000 barrels of oil a day as a subsidy to continue their work and their repression of the Cuban people and the terrible living conditions that they're in. So they're in public education, which is a way of controlling minds and hearts. And I remember how the first ministry that went to an avowed communist after defense was education. Armando Hart became the head of Cuba's education ministry back in the early 60s. It's a way of controlling what people are reading, what people are studying, because education is subverted for political propaganda purposes to wash the minds of young people. Now, this sounds all Cold War-ish, and it sounds crazy stuff. It's going on today. So with the Cuban help, in addition to that, sources within the Venezuelan military say that Cuban military experts control several security circles that protect President Hugo Chavez. He doesn't trust his Venezuelans. He has to have his Cuban thugs there to keep him alive and protect him, and that they have penetrated strategic areas of the armed forces and the central government, including the Situation Room in Miraflores, Venezuela's presidential palace. So they run his security, they run his Situation Room at the equivalent of their White House, and Cuban advisors play a critical role. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because it shows the linkage, the alliance, the partnership, the working together of Venezuela and Cuba to try to spread their brand of anti-Americanism and socialism throughout Latin America, where they're having, frankly, significant success with Venezuela's oil wealth, with Cuba's know-how of the security apparatus and control. That's all working very well for them. Because, see, here's the next news item in that same article by the Miami Herald. It also mentions that an additional area where the Cubans are providing their dark expertise is in the area of policing. They're working as advisors to the police forces throughout the country, and Cuban advisors would play a critical role. It won't be long before we'll be seeing the committees for the defense of the revolution coming to a neighborhood near you in Venezuela. That's unfortunate, and that's bad for the Venezuelan people. But here's now another thing not in the United States policy interest. Chavez, another headline, and this morning, Chavez orders expropriation of Cargill's rice plant. Another Miami Herald story. Well, last I knew, Cargill is an American company. Last I knew, American investors put their good money and have processing plants, Minneapolis, Minnesota-based company, and they operate in Venezuela. In good faith, invested, in good faith, attempted to provide a service to the Venezuelan industry and commerce. And so now we find out that it's a purposeful, continuing attempt to expropriate, without appropriate compensation, American properties. We go full circle. This is how the Cuban trade sanctions began under the Eisenhower administration. Almost sounds comical now. And the fact is that it began because of Cubans' expropriations of American property in Cuba without proper compensation and in violation of every international law and rule existing to man. So today we find that in partnership, the Cuban and Venezuelans are once again continuing this advance of anti-Americanism, of expropriation of American properties, of taking out each and every one. In this article, I believe it details additionally how Empresas Polar, another private enterprise, is no longer going to be private because the government has taken it over. And so over the past year, Chavez has nationalized Venezuela's largest telephone, electric, and cement companies. His government is also negotiating compensation for a takeover of the country's biggest steelmaker, Sidor. So as we can see, it is a pattern of government control from the police forces that are being now trained by the Cubans, have been really, to the security apparatus around President for Life, Hugo Chavez, to everything else that goes on around them. We find that the Cuban presence is there and is continuing and is ever present. So at a time when all this is taking place, at a time when just today, these 3 news articles are in our news media. This is just today, by the way. There are things like this every day about what is going on in Latin America, right under our noses.